So my name is Jacqueline Woodson, and I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was 7 years old, and I've written 29 books now, everything from picture books to middle grade to young adult fiction, and I write a lot of book. I write across genres because I get bored just writing one thing, and I'm usually working on more than one book at a time. So if I get bored with one, I go to the other. If I get bored with that, I go to the next. And most of my writing is realistic fiction, except for Showa, which is a history of my family from my great great grandma to the present. But most of them are written about people who seem like they could be in the world. And I get my ideas from everywhere, from the newspaper, from things I see on the street, from other books I read, from talking to my friends, from talking to my family. And I just think that ideas are in the air. Usually when I start to write a book, the first thing I have in my head is the character. And so I have the character, and the character's kind of formed. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know what their story is. But I just start writing. I never outline. I never know where it's going. I just start writing and see where it takes me. And then I get to a point where I have to kind of figure it out. And in the case of Hush, which is the story of a girl and her family who become part of the Witness Protection Program, I didn't know anything about the Witness Protection Program. So when I realized that they were going to be a part of it, I had to start researching it. And I have a couple of journalist friends. So my friend Linda works for the New York Times, so I asked her to gather as much information about it as she could. With Miracles Boys, which is about three brothers who are raising themselves after their parents die, I didn't know a lot about what it would mean for a young kid to raise his younger siblings, what it meant in terms of the socioeconomics of it, what it meant in terms of the legal issues surrounding it, what it meant in terms of education and the law. You know, I know law is the legal issues. So I just had to kind of read about if a 21-year-old was raising his kids, who would be involved from the state, who would be involved at the local level, and how would this all get monitored. And so a lot of it, and also I didn't know a lot about diabetes, and so I had to kind of research that. If someone were to die from freezing, what would that look like? And so those are the kind of things I read. And I'll interrupt the writing and just spend some time researching it. You know, it's hard because I hadn't realized when I wrote Feathers that there weren't a lot of books about deaf culture, and there had never been a book about an African American kid who was deaf. And I just didn't know. I knew that I was writing realistic fiction, and I was writing about different cultures. And you know, there's so many cultures in the world. There's the different cultures I come from. They're the cultures that I've found. There's cultures that aren't even acknowledged as cultures. And so I thought it's amazing to have grown up and become this age and not ever have read a book about the deaf community. I decided to make Sean deaf because he is, because because I wanted. Feathers is a book about the different ways people have hope in the world and our search for hope in the world, and I wanted Sean's journey in there, the journey of being deaf in a hearing family. And what does that mean? I think it's something we don't think about a lot. I think we think of deafness as other. We think of it as something that is not a culture, but too often people think of it as a handicap. And deaf culture, you know, is not. Deaf should be a capital D, just like African American culture. And so I wanted to put on the page a kid who had his culture, who had, you know, the deaf community and his world and a supportive family that wasn't saying, be like us, but saying, you know, you're a gift to us and we want to move into your world. And then also his longing, because they all had longings, and his longing was to be a part of both worlds, to not be deaf. He never says, he never says, I want to be a hearing person. He says, I want to be a deaf person who can exist in both worlds the way you as a hearing person exist in my world. And it was important for me in talking about the ways people have hope and the ways people move through the world, and showing all these worlds through this group of young people. And when I first started writing it, It was actually called the Jesus Boy, and the Jesus Boy was one of the was the main character. And as the story started unfolding, I thought this is not simply about him, but about this whole world of kids and their strength and their weaknesses and their journeys. Shoei actually begins, when Suni's great grandma was 7. She was sold from the Virginia land to a plantation in South Carolina without her ma or pa. But what's a Muslim, her ma had given her, and 2 needles she got from the big house, and thread dyed bright red with berries from the chokecherry tree. And I knew about chokecherry trees. I knew about my grandmother Suni. I knew about her grandmother, although I didn't know her name. And when my grandmother was getting sick, so my family would never tell me stories, but they would talk to each other. Well, you remember when Suni blah blah blah, or Suni was so mean, and so I caught snippets all my life, and I knew this family history, sort of. But when my grandmother was getting older and had no great-grandchildren, and I had been saying I was going to have a baby forever, and I hadn't yet. And so then she was getting older. She's like, well, I guess I won't get any great-grandbabies, so, if you ever do have one, make sure you tell about Suni and, and those blankets we made, and make sure Aunt Lucinda gives you one of the quilts that and I had none of this information. And so I told her that one day when I had a baby, I would like to give it one of the names of our family. So can you just tell me everybody's name? She had 12 brothers and sisters. And she started telling me the names, which were like Verdi and Viola. And I'm thinking, my child is not going to be named any of these names. And then she started telling me more and more stories. And then she died 4 months before I got pregnant with Toshi. And so when I had Toshi, I knew I wanted to tell the story of the maternal line of the family. And so I started writing Shoei, and then I ended up going back to South Carolina to talk to my aunt, who died soon after, and to talk to my cousins, and to try to piece together the story of the history of the Underground Railroad and what the part that the Scotts and the Irbies played in it. I'm not here accidentally. I'm not, sitting here talking about my writing. I'm not here as a mom. I'm not here as an activist and all the things that I try to do because I just decided to do it one day. I'm here because my mother, was part of the civil rights movement. I'm here because my grandmother was a teacher. I'm here because my great-great-grandparents were, part of the Underground Railroad. I'm here because of the quilts. I'm here because of the language. I'm here because of the food. And so it was, and my daughter is too. And so I wanted to just kind of keep that strand going and acknowledge the people that came before me. And I had no idea that there was any controversy regarding the fact that quilts were used in the Underground Railroad. And I remember the first time I heard it, and and I thought, well, my grandmother wasn't lying. And so this woman had said, well, there's no written documentation. I'm like, the history of African Americans is oral history. We were not allowed to learn to read and write. And nobody was going to go up in the big house and say, Master, can you write down this story about how we were escaping using these quilts in the Underground Railroad? I mean, it was so ridiculous to me on so many levels. And so a lot of our history, we had names and birth dates and stuff written in Bibles. And by I think, it was the early 1900s, there was some census stuff that we were able to access. But one of the controversies was the square in the middle of one of the quilt pieces, because it was black, and they said there was no black at that time. And it turned out it was indigo, because the indigo is what the Africans brought over. I mean, it was just, but I just thought, I was so stunned, because I thought, how dare you doubt my history? How dare you call my grandma a liar and the people who came before her? And then, if that's the case, then how are we here? And I think there is this part of people who want to doubt that slaves had the ability to get free. It happened to me twice. It happened, and I haven't written about the second time yet, but the second time is the Woodson side. The Woodson side, I don't know if you know the Woodson side, but that's Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. So it's the Woodson line comes out of that. And so we always knew that. And first, as an adult, they were saying Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson were never together. Well, they were together, but they didn't have children. Yeah, well, they had the children. The Woodsons were the children. Then they finally did DNA testing, and they realized, oops, yes, these is Woodson children. These are the descendants. And so, and so, I think in terms of being a writer and thinking about our history and how important it is to write stuff down. Like a lot of the stuff, obviously, that I write is realistic fiction, but I am thinking more and more about writing more nonfiction just to bear witness and document what I know, what I've experienced, and to not lose these strands and show there's a line, that slave was killed running off to the north side of the war months before he got to meet his baby girl, a girl child who was born free that same year, 1863. History went and lost her name. Years later, Suni came. So that was Suni's mother, and we don't have any documentation of her name. And so I thought, as I was writing Showay, that I'd make up a name for her. And then I thought, no, I think this needs to be written down, that we did lose some of our history on this journey. I think the thing about kids who are reluctant to pick up books, to read, I think it's twofold. I was a slow reader. I struggled as a reader, and I think part of it was I didn't care about the books that people were giving me to read. And growing up in the 70s and trying to find myself on the page was not happening. There was Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Phyllis Wheatley, and everyone had been a slave or escaped slavery or learned to read during slavery or like beat up someone during slavery. And it was like, okay, this is the 1970s. Have my people done anything since then? But of course I didn't know how to ask those questions. I was in the second grade, and I think when finally the books. I remember discovering John Steptoe's book, Stevie, and it was a book where the people spoke like me, the people looked like me. They probably lived in New York City, so the apartment looked like my house. And it was eye-opening, and I think, and it got me excited about reading. And then I went on from there to The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde, and to Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl. And I could begin to find parts of myself in books that seemingly had nothing to do with me. But I think we have to be respectful of the young people and say, where are you in this book? And I think that's the first thing, to get them to see themselves in the literature. I mean, in the book of Locomotion, there are so many kids, Black, white, Latino, Chicano, who live like Lonnie lives. And there's so many kids who don't, but who know what it means to have been away from someone they love, to know what it means to kind of have this story that you're eager to tell, and no one has ever said to you, you have a right to tell it, as his teacher finally says to him. And so many kids who just have some kind of longing for home, for a certain kind of family, for food, whatever it is, and find themselves on the pages. I think the other thing is, I think if you're a struggling reader, reading can be really overwhelming to you. And the idea of someone handing you a book that's 50 pages, that's 100 pages, that's 150 pages, it's like, where do you even begin? And I always think it's important to give kids one paragraph, give them one paragraph and let them expound about that paragraph, and let that paragraph make them hungry for more. And I think, you do it the same way you do with young people. You give them small portions of things and you let them grow to be hungry for more and more, and eventually they are. And then there are the kids who might not be reading fiction, who are looking for nonfiction, who are looking for poetry, who are looking for spoken word, whose way of understanding, their move toward comprehension is more oral. So, a book on tape is probably the way to go, or an excerpt from a book on tape. Or on my website, I have a video of Feathers, and it's kind of a visual description of what the girl is talking about, because some people need that. They need to see the picture in order to understand the words. And I think that shift from picture books to non-illustrated books is fast. All of a sudden you've comprehended something and the pictures disappear and you're like, whoa, I'm not supposed to be reading those anymore. And I think it's important, for middle graders, for high schoolers, to be able to go back to picture books and to and to learn how to read and understand and write. I mean, when I'm stuck as a writer, I go right back to the picture books because the language is simple, deceptively simple, and it's immediate and it's not overwhelming. And I think so much of it is how we get overwhelmed. I think the thing I try to do as a writer is bring worlds to the page. And I think what happens with readers is they step inside those worlds and they experience them in a way that they might not in their real life. And so it gives them a chance to think about a bigger society and a greater good. I mean, the constant question kids ask themselves is, if it was me, what would I do? How would I engage with how would I treat the Jesus boy? How would I treat Sean? Who would I be? Would I be Franny, or would I be someone else in this, or Madeline? Is her name Samantha? Sorry, in the story. And by the time they get to the end of the book, the asking of what happens next, and my question always to young people is, well, what do you think happens next? Or what would happen if it was your story, or if you were one of these characters? Young people get mad at me all the time and write and say, well, why did you decide that kid had to die, or that kid had to move away, or that Lonnie is not reunited with his sister by the end of the first locomotion? And I think it's a way of beginning a discussion. What's the happily ever after? How often does the happily ever after happen? And in the real world, what have you experienced, or what do you see, or what do you know from your family? And then I think in terms of getting young people to talk about their lives, and to talk about the lives of others, and to talk about events in the world. And it's such a social period from kindergarten to first grade. In the picture book area time, they're learning how to get along, they're learning how to be in the world, they're learning how to be human in the world. And then when they get to be adolescents, they're learning who they are and their power in the world, and they're learning about identity politics, who names them, how they name themselves. And a lot of, with Hush, the book about the Witness Protection Program, the big question is, when someone takes your name away, who do you become? And so if I woke up tomorrow and I couldn't be Jacqueline Woodson, what would that mean? How would I begin to re-identify myself? And I think a lot of that stuff is stuff kids are wondering and thinking about and talking about every day. And so for me to be able to sit down and create a world where they can exist in it. John Gardner, who wrote a book called On Becoming a Novelist, talks about the fictive dream, the dream of fiction, and how when you're reading a book, you're in that dream, that world is real to you, and you're a part of it, and no one can tell you those people don't exist. And I think that when I sit down and try to create that dream of fiction, first for myself and then for my readers, by the time I'm finished with the book, the readers really do believe and care about and love the characters. And when they love someone, they'll do whatever they can to kind of protect them and hold on to them and change the world for them. And I think that's the big gift of fiction. It gives young people the courage to create change and to talk about change and to talk about different ways of being in the world, of themselves being in the world, of adults being in the world, of what's wrong with the world, what's right with it. I think there's always going to be a gap for young people looking for images of themselves in the literature. And I think partly is because everything's changing so quickly. And I think that at the same time, the essence of childhood doesn't change. So there's always going to be some way now to fill it. I mean, what young people want are stories that deal with issues of them trying to figure out who they are in the world. So they feel isolated. They feel like they're the only ones like that, that their crazy family is the only crazy family like that, and that their longings are the only longings like that. And so I think they find their way. I mean, I think I was talking about this yesterday young people are hungry and their brains are huge, and they are going to find their way the way we found our way. And I think there's going to be the literature that helps. I think there's always a need for more stories. I mean, I think, now we're looking at the gap in literature, and I get constant emails about, why isn't there more literature that's targeted at gay, lesbian, transgender youth? Why isn't there more literature that's targeted at biracial families? More literature that's targeted at single parent families and parent now, of course, with all the foreclosures, what does it mean to suddenly lose your home and be, that whole issue of displacement, which we weren't dealing with so much in the 70s and 80s and 90s as we are dealing with now. There's always going to be a hunger. They're always going to have a hunger because that's what adolescence is. And there's always going to be a certain sorrow to their existence because they need to live in that world. I know it sounds cliche, but I was in Kansas. I was in Topeka, and it was an all-white school, and the teacher said to me, well, we don't get a lot of books about African Americans because we don't have African Americans in our school. And I thought, are your kids always going to be here? And I said, well, when your kids leave here and they come to New York City, I don't want my child to be the first Black person they ever encounter, because that's going to be way too foreign for them. So why don't we start with the literature? And the same thing is, I think it's important that if your school system is not racially or economically or diverse in terms of gender, that the books still reflect that, because the kids need to meet people unlike themselves and find the place in those people and in the story where they share a common ground, because it's the beginning of the connections that literature is trying to form, that education is trying to form. We're trying to figure out how to connect with people and work together and make a better world. I mean, that's what education is. It's about understanding. It's about overcoming ignorance. It's about overcoming intolerance and, bigotry. And so all of that, the more people know about other people, the less doubt there will be. And so I think that we have to constantly publish books that talk about that. And there's always going to be a need. And they're not so. I think now we have a lot of books and we can use a lot more books, and I think there's a need of getting those books out into the world and people realizing that this book about this gay white boy from California is very valid in my classroom, because I don't want my kids to grow up to beat up this boy. So that kind of stuff is so important. But, we still have a lot of issues of censorship, of books getting challenged, of parents thinking they know what the book's about by reading the flap copy and deciding that's enough to not allow their kids to read the book. So we're still living in a time of fear and censorship, which is heartbreaking. But at the same time, the great thing is adolescents are resilient and people are going to find what they need. In terms of writing, I never think of my stuff as controversial. Other people call it that, but I think of it as real world. I write realistic fiction, and in writing realistic fiction, I try to represent all the people, and as many people as I can get in the world who are walking through the world onto the pages. And so I remember when I wrote If You Come Softly, which is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, and I tried to make a present-day story about Romeo and Juliet, and it's about an interracial relationship between a middle-class African-American boy and a middle-class white Jewish girl. And it got challenged. And it got challenged because of the interracial relationship. And this is, 40 years after miscegenation laws have been taken out of the world. And I'm also really careful in how I qualify. One thing I grew up with was literature where I'd read it and say, well, a boy walked down the street, and then a girl walked down the street, and then a black boy walked down the street. And I thought, okay, so I just assume whiteness unless otherwise stated. And I never do that. And when I was teaching, I never let my students do that. If you qualify the race of one, qualify the race of the other, so that the reader doesn't feel like I'm on the outside of this because I'm that black boy reading this story, or I'm that white boy reading this story. And that kind of stuff is really important and urgent to me. But I think a lot of times the stuff that people are uncomfortable with is stuff they're uncomfortable with, and they're going to continue to be uncomfortable with. And I think it's part of the reason I write for young adults, because they're not. They're just figuring it all out, and they're open, and they're brilliant. And they're going to change the world. So that's where I began. So I knew I wanted to be a writer since I was 7, but I didn't grow up in a family where there were writers. So it was kind of like saying, I want to grow up and be homeless, because my family was like, you're never going to make any money. Are you crazy? Like, this isn't what we do. You need to get a job. Like, and okay, that's a nice hobby, but what are you going to do to make some money and eventually get out of our house? And so I wouldn't tell the truth. I would say, I'm going to be a teacher, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a hairdresser, whatever, But I knew I was going to be a writer, and I just wrote all the time. And I had teachers who encouraged it. I had teachers who saw that, that brilliance is passion recognized. If someone has something they're really passionate at, that's their brilliance. And how do we grow that, or help them to grow that? And so I wrote all the time. I copied writers. I remember finding a collection of poems, American Negro Poetry Anthology, that was edited by Arna Bontemps, and I read it through. I memorized all these poems. I started trying to write like Claude McKay and Audre Lorde and stuff, and Langston Hughes, of course. But I just knew that I wanted to be a writer. When my family realized I was serious, when I would walk into the room, they would get quiet, because they're like, okay, she's going to write all about us if she's writing. And I'm like, you guys are not that interesting. But I couldn't say that, I would get in trouble. But I wanted to write about my community. Like, I wanted to put the world I knew on the page. And so I had never read books about Brooklyn. I had never read books about people going from Brooklyn to South Carolina and back again, until I read Zealey by Virginia Hamilton. And that was one of the first books that I thought, wow, not only is this person writing about stuff that I know, but it's a Black woman writing about it. And so Black women do write books. And it was a moment that turned me around, just like the moment with John Steptoe and reading Stevie. And then I started discovering other writers like James Baldwin and Alice Walker and Mildred Taylor, and just reading all these stories that were so populated with people who were familiar to me really just made the fire to write burn even hotter. And so I wrote all the time. And the first novel was Last Summer with Mason, which is about 2 girls growing up in Brooklyn, and one gets accepted to a predominantly white boarding school, and what that means to leave your community and have to come back to your community, and what does it mean for the people who you've left. And so, and then as I got braver as a writer, I started moving out of my community and the first book, from the Notebooks of Melanin Sun, was the first time I wrote from the point of view of a guy. I had written all these books from the point of view of girls, and I said, I know I can do that. Let me try this other thing. And it took forever. It took about 2.5 years, and I just struggled, and I couldn't get his voice on the page, and I asked my brothers, and they didn't remember what it was like to be that age, and I would watch guys in the playground, and that wasn't what I was going for. And then I just kind of did this thing where I said, okay, if I had a son, what would he be like? What would I want him to be like? If I had a best friend that was a boy, what would he be like? If 3 boys were in a room, what would they talk about? And just ask myself all these questions, and finally started forming this kid. And the more I wrote him, the more I liked them, and the more I tried to make them real. One of the things I find a lot when I'm traveling is that kids talk about having writer's block, and I actually don't believe in writer's block. I think it's more fear-based, and I think it's important that we get young people to realize that, as I said earlier, they have stories to tell, and they have a right to tell those stories. And I think once they're freed up to know they have a right to tell those stories, that they begin to tell them, and without the judgment of family or friends or teachers. And so I always think it's important to say to kids, when you give them a writing assignment, that no one is ever going to see this. That what you're writing down right now, right here, so write as much as you want and tell everything and put it all on the page, and then rewrite it and rewrite it, and in that rewrite, put down everything you want us to see and get rid of everything else. And so that gives them a draft and a rewrite almost immediately. And then the next time you write it, say, well, this time you're going to read it out loud. So why don't you practice reading it out loud? Do you like the way it sounds? Are you stumbling over any words? But also keep it short. I think not to write 3 pages, but to write a page, and sometimes maybe not to write a page, but to write a paragraph. And also for the young writers to try to write for at least 15 minutes a day, and tell your stories and read. I mean, the way you learn to write is by reading, and reading the same book sometimes over and over, and understanding how the author tells the stories and how you probably have a lot in common with what the author is doing. My name is Jacqueline Woodson, and this is Peace Locomotion, which is a sequel to Locomotion. And Locomotion was written entirely in verse. He was learning how to write poetry and tell the story of his life through poetry. And then I decided to write a sequel, and it's written in letters, and it's letters to his younger sister, chronicling the time that they're separated, which is now. They're living apart, and he's living with his foster mom and a foster brother named Rodney, and he has a second foster brother who's fighting in the war. And so this is a letter to his sister regarding that brother, whose name is Jenkins. Dear Lily, I can't write a real lot tonight. We got news that Jenkins is missing from the war. Something bad happened and nobody knows where he's at. Miss Edna's been praying all day and Rodney's been on the phone trying to get some information. Miss Edna sat down hard on the couch and let out deep, shaky breaths. Rodney sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulder. He kept saying, "It's gonna be all right, Mama. Everything's gonna be all right." I said that maybe we should turn on the news, and Rodney thought that was a good idea. I turned on the television and sat down on the other side of Miss Edna and held her hand. She kept saying over and over, "Lord, please bring my baby back home." We watched the CNN channel that has news all the time. The newscaster lady kept talking about insurgents and a car bomb and missing soldiers. I waited to see Jenkins' face on the screen. For some reason, I thought I'd see him there, smiling and holding up those rabbit ears behind someone's head, but it didn't happen. Miss Edna finally got up and went into her room. I made me and Rodney some peanut butter sandwiches, and we turned the news off and just sat there for a while, chewing and not saying nothing. Rodney said that his mama was probably in her room praying, and I asked what he thought we should be praying for. "Peace, man," he said. "Pray for peace." I'd almost finished my sandwich, but Rodney still had a whole half of his to go. I asked him, didn't he want to pray for Jenkins being okay? Because that's what I was thinking about praying for. Rodney was about to put some sandwich in his mouth, but he put it back down on his plate. We were sitting on the couch kind of facing each other, and he leaned a little bit closer to me. "The way I see it," he said, "you pray for peace and all the rest of the stuff comes. If there was peace, no one would be getting hurt or killed or jacked up in a war, right?" I nodded. "Peace covers everything, little brother, everything." So now I'm in my room and the lamp is on so that I can finish writing you this letter. From now on, I'm going to be doing everything for peace, Lily. I'm going to be praying for it and thinking about it and trying to make it a part of every single thing. Peace, Lily. Love, your brother forever, Lonnie.